In the history of modern American football, the name Bill Romanowski is always mentioned as one of the fiercest and most durable linebackers to ever step onto an NFL field. Over his 16 professional seasons, Romanowski played for some of the league's biggest teams and became part of some of football's greatest dynasties. He won 4 Super Bowl championships, an achievement very few defensive players can touch. First hoisting the trophy with the San Francisco 49ers in Super Bowl 23 and Super Bowl 23, and Super Bowl 24, before going on to write another glorious chapter with the Denver Broncos by winning Super Bowl 32 and Super Bowl 33. In a career spanning more than a decade and a half, Romanowski appeared in 243 games, recorded over 1,000 tackles, nearly 40 sacks, and 18 interceptions, numbers that reflect the rare durability of a linebacker. He was selected to the Pro Bowl twice, made the All-Pro team, and was known in the locker room as one of the players willing to sacrifice everything to protect his teammates. With his uncompromising playing style, Romanowski became an icon of the fighting spirit in the NFL's toughest era, a man whom both teammates and opponents knew would never back down even 1 inch on the grass once the game began. But behind those championship rings and those impressive statistics is another story that is rarely seen. Romanowski's life was not defined only by victories, but also by the wounds that football left behind. After thousands of brutal collisions, his body carried chronic pain, and his memory sometimes grew foggy from the repeated concussions throughout his career. His reputation was not always shining. Many called him a violent player, even the villain of the NFL. The controversies, the mistakes, and the outbursts of anger forced Romanowski to face nationwide criticism. But what makes his story special is not those scars, but the unyielding will behind them. Romanowski always believed that a warrior is not allowed to fall before adversity, whether that adversity came from opponents, from public opinion, or from his own body. Even after leaving the field, he kept fighting, this time, not to win a game, but to find balance again, to heal the damage, and to prove that a person's true strength lies not in how many opponents they defeat, but in how many times they can get back up after the battles of their own life. If the story of Bill Romanowski makes you think about the real cost of glory in the NFL, please hit subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring the turbulent journey behind the life of this warrior, before he became the man that all of America both feared and argued about. Before those Super Bowl rings gleamed under the stadium lights, Bill Romanowski was just a boy growing up in the small town of Rockville in the state of Connecticut. That was not a place that produced sports legends. It was a quiet community with narrow streets, modest homes, and ordinary working families trying to build a better life for their children. But for Bill Romanowski, childhood there was not easy or peaceful days. It was the place where he learned his first lessons about strength, toughness, and a world where weakness was not allowed to exist. The Romanowski family was a disciplined one. His parents believed strongly in traditional values: responsibility, hard work, and endurance. But in that house, affection was rarely expressed in words. There were no frequent hugs. There were no easy praises. Everything was shown through expectations and the high standards a child had to strive to meet. Bill's father was a strict man, someone who believed life was never easy for anyone. He taught his son a simple but cold philosophy. A man has to be tough. No weakness allowed. No complaining. And if the world knocks you down, you have to get up faster before it gets the chance to crush you. Those teachings sank deep into young Bill's mind from a very early age. While other kids ran around and laughed without thinking too much about life, Bill Romanowski began to see the world as a competition. In his eyes, everything was a game that had to be won. If playing ball in the backyard, he wanted to win. If racing friends, he had to finish first. And if someone challenged him, Bill would never be the one to back down. His childhood friends later recalled that Bill always played every game as if it were the biggest match of his life. There was no concept of playing for fun. There was no concept of try again next time. For that boy, losing was not just losing a game. It felt like a personal failure, something unacceptable. From very early on, Bill Romanowski developed a personality that the entire NFL would later come to know, an almost uncontrollable competitive will. Sports quickly became the only place where that boy truly felt he belonged. On the field, everything was clearer. There were rules. There was a goal. There were winners and losers. And most importantly, there was a chance to prove strength. Football especially captivated Romanowski because it was the sport of collisions, of power, and of fearless men. When Bill first put on the pads and stepped onto the field, something inside him was awakened. There, the toughness his father always talked about became an advantage. The hits did not scare Bill. On the contrary, they made him feel alive. Each time he launched into a tackle, each time he got back up after a fall, he felt a little stronger. Coaches began to notice the boy with that intense glare. They saw a young player who never shied away from contact, someone ready to throw his entire body into every play. But what many did not see back then was the price a young soul had to pay for that toughness. When you learn to fight too early, you also learn to hide your emotions. Romanowski gradually became the type of person who did not talk much about his feelings. If in pain, he stayed silent. If angry, he turned it into energy on the field. If feeling misunderstood, he just played harder. Those years in Connecticut laid the foundation for everything that would happen later in Romanowski's life. They created a young man who never wanted to be seen as weak. Someone who believed the world was always testing you, and the only way to survive was to fight. But they also planted inside him an uncontrollable fire of competition, of anger, and of the fear that if he wasn't stronger than everyone else, he would be left behind. As Bill Romanowski grew up, the world around him began to realize that this boy was not like the others. He didn't just want to play football, he wanted to conquer it. And in the years to come, as Romanowski stepped onto bigger stadiums and tougher games, that fire ignited from his childhood would become the driving force that propelled him to the top of the NFL. But at the same time, that very fire would also bring storms that few could have imagined. His high school years marked the time when the world started to recognize that young Bill Romanowski was different from everyone else. At Rockville High School in Connecticut, Bill Romanowski quickly became one of the most standout athletes. On the football field, he didn't just play well. He played with an intensity that demanded attention. Every time the ball was snapped, Bill charged into opponents with every ounce of his power, as if it wasn't just an ordinary high school game, but a fight for survival. His tackles were so hard that the crowd in the stands sometimes went silent for a few seconds after the collision. Coaches started telling each other that this kid had something truly special, a rare defensive instinct, a grit that not every young player possessed. But along with that talent came something else they couldn't ignore. A fire inside Bill Romanowski that always seemed to burn too hot. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to dominate, to crush opponents, to prove he was stronger than anyone on the field. Football gradually became the place where Romanowski poured out every emotion he didn't know how to express in words. If he had a bad day at school, he brought it to practice. If he felt disrespected, he turned it into harder hits. Teammates remembered that Bill was always the one who practiced the longest and played the most fiercely in every scrimmage. Sometimes, even during practice, he would still charge into plays with the intensity of a real game. The coaches were both impressed and concerned. They saw in Romanowski a huge, talented linebacker who could go very far in football. But they also saw a boy carrying too much angry energy, a fire that could make him a star, or could burn him up if it wasn't controlled. Those high school years were also when Romanowski began to understand that football could become the path that took him out of that small town. College recruiters started noticing him. They saw powerful, quick, and fearless hitter qualities that college football programs were always looking for. But what stuck with them most about Bill wasn't just his physical abilities. It was the look in his eyes every time he stepped onto the field. A gaze so focused it was almost ferocious, as if he was preparing for a battle rather than a sports game. For Romanowski, football wasn't just a game. It was the place where he proved he was tough enough to survive in a world where, from childhood, he had been taught that only the hard ones could stand firm. But it was during this period that the first signs of his inner struggle also began to appear. When someone learns to fight too early, they sometimes forget how to stop. Romanowski grew more and more extreme in his approach to the game. Every match felt like a personal challenge. Every opponent felt like an obstacle that had to be destroyed. The coaches understood that this competitive fire was what made great players. But they also knew that if that fire burned too hot, it could become dangerous. And when Bill Romanowski left those explosive high school years behind to step into a bigger football world, few could have known that the fire in that boy would never truly go out. It would only burn more fiercely, leading him to the heights of glory and to the storms that the entire NFL would later witness. When he left those explosive high school years and stepped into the college football environment, Bill Romanowski carried with him everything that had shaped who he was: toughness, an uncompromising competitive spirit, and a fire that seemed never to know how to die out. His next destination was Boston College, a football program known for its strict discipline and infamous for its grueling training environment. For many young players, the jump from high school to college level was a huge shock. The game was faster, the opponents stronger, the pressure greater. But for Romanowski, it felt like a door opening to his fighting instincts. At Boston College, for the first time, he was placed in an environment where everyone was tough, everyone was ambitious, and everyone was willing to do whatever it took to survive on the field. And it was right there that Bill Romanowski began transforming himself from an energetic young player into a true warrior. The practices at Boston College were anything but easy. Every day started early in the morning with brutal strength workouts, long runs, and hitting drills that sometimes left young players exhausted right from the first week. The coaches didn't care where you came from, whether you were a high school star or how much the press had praised you. Here, there was only one rule: if you weren't strong enough, you would be replaced. Romanowski understood that very quickly, and instead of being afraid, he dove into that environment with all his ferocity. In every practice, he was always the one delivering the hardest hits. In every scrimmage, he played as if it were the national championship game. The coaches began to realize that this young man from Connecticut didn't just have good physical tools, he also had a rare aggressiveness. Romanowski gradually became one of the most noticeable linebackers on the team. He read plays quickly, reacted powerfully, and especially never backed down from contact. His tackles often made the crowd in the stands gasp at the sheer intensity. Teammates started looking at him as a leader of the defense, a player always ready to sacrifice his body to stop any opponent's attack. In many people's eyes, Romanowski was developing into the ideal modern linebacker: strong, smart, and fearless. But it was also during this period that something else began to worry many people. Romanowski didn't just play hard. He played with an almost extreme level of ferocity. For him, football wasn't just about winning the game, it felt like a personal war. When an opponent went down after one of his tackles, Romanowski didn't just feel satisfied for completing his defensive assignment. He felt like he had just won a deeper battle that only he understood. Some coaches started telling each other that this young man had everything it took to become a big player in the NFL, but they also wondered if the fire inside him was burning too hot. College football also began teaching Romanowski his first lessons about the true cost of the sport. The hits became heavier. Practices left his body aching for days. There were games where, after they ended, he could barely lift his arms from sheer exhaustion. But instead of making him back down, those hardships only made Romanowski more convinced that he was on the right path. In his mind, football wasn't something to do halfway. Either you threw yourself into it with every ounce of your strength, or it would swallow you whole. His years at Boston College changed Romanowski in many ways. He learned strategy, discipline, and how to read plays at a higher level. But more importantly, he learned how to turn his fighting instinct into a weapon. The coaches molded him into a true linebacker one who could control the field, lead the defense, and stand firm in the toughest battles football had to offer. But deep inside, the fire Romanowski carried from childhood was still there. It had never truly died down. It only grew bigger, and when Romanowski left Boston College to chase his NFL dream, few knew that that fire would not only help him conquer the peaks of professional football, it would also bring controversies, media storms, and inner struggles that he would have to face for the rest of his life. After the grueling years at Boston College, where he had been forged into a true linebacker, Bill Romanowski's path finally led to the door every young player dreams of, the NFL. When his name was called in the 1988 draft by the San Francisco 49ers, Romanowski knew his life had just entered a completely new chapter. It wasn't just the dream of becoming a pro player. It was stepping into a world where only the strongest survived. And there was no place harsher than the NFL in the late 1980s. The 49ers at that time weren't just any team. They were a dynasty, a winning machine with stars like Joe Montana and Jerry Rice, names that had already become legends in American football. For a young player like Romanowski, walking into that locker room felt like entering an entirely different world. The men around him didn't just play football. They lived for it. They trained with an intensity Romanowski had never seen before. And every day, everyone had to prove they deserved to stay. Those first few weeks in the NFL quickly taught Romanowski something he had only partially sensed before. Football at this level was no longer a game. It was war. Every play felt like a continuous collision of bodies over 200 pounds slamming into each other at full speed. The tackles weren't just harder. They were brutal, ruthless, and unforgiving. There was no room for hesitation. No time to think too long. If you were half a second slow, you got crushed. Romanowski began to realize that everything he had gone through in high school or college was just preparation for this reality. The NFL didn't care where you had been a star. Every week, you had to fight to keep your spot. Every week, you had to prove you were tough enough to survive in a sport built on contact. At first, Romanowski wasn't a star. He mostly played on special teams, a role with little glamour but extreme toughness. Special teams plays were often the most violent collisions on the field. Players ran at full speed from opposite sides and crashed into each other like oncoming trains. Many feared those plays, but Romanowski felt that's exactly where he belonged. He charged into every tackle with the same intensity he had shown at Boston College, if not more fiercely. The coaches started to take notice. They saw in this young man something many other players didn't have. He wasn't afraid of pain. In fact, it seemed Romanowski accepted pain as a natural part of the game. But as the season went on, Romanowski began to understand a deeper truth about the world he had just entered. In the NFL, toughness wasn't just an advantage, it was a requirement for survival. Weaker players, those who couldn't handle the intensity of the hits, disappeared very quickly. One injury, one bad season, and they could be replaced by another rookie waiting for a chance. Romanowski saw it every day in the locker room. Big, strong men who still got cut when they weren't fast enough or strong enough anymore. It was a ruthless world, and Romanowski understood that if he wanted to stay, he had to become as ruthless as the sport itself. Gradually, that philosophy began to take shape in him. If football was war, then he would become a warrior. If opponents came at him with all their power, he would hit back even harder. Every tackle became a statement that he belonged here. Every game was a chance to prove that the kid from Connecticut wasn't just another name on the roster. He was someone who could survive in the harshest environment in American sports. And over time, his teammates began to look at Romanowski with growing respect. They knew that when the game got tight, when opponents started playing dirtier, Romanowski would be the first one to step up. But along with that respect, something else also began to form his reputation. Romanowski didn't just play hard. He played with an intensity that sometimes left others stunned. For him, every play felt like a personal battle. Some people started saying that Romanowski played as if he was trying to prove something to the whole world. Maybe they were right, because deep in his mind, Romanowski had accepted a truth that many didn't dare speak to survive in the NFL. Sometimes you had to become the guy others feared, and for Bill Romanowski, that was the only way to turn his football dream into reality. Those first few years of his professional career taught Bill Romanowski how to survive in a ruthless world. But then the thing that the boy from Connecticut had dreamed about his entire childhood finally arrived. Romanowski didn't just survive in the NFL, he began to win. When he put on the San Francisco 49ers jersey, he became part of the greatest team of that era. This was a collective built to dominate, a team full of legends, led by brilliant tactical minds and players who could change an entire game in just a few seconds. For Romanowski, standing in that locker room every day felt like living the dream he had once imagined as a kid playing ball on the small grass fields back in Connecticut. And then that dream became reality. Romanowski and the 49ers won 2 consecutive Super Bowl championships. Those moments every NFL player craves to experience at least once in their life. When the final whistle blew, when the confetti fell onto the field and the Lombardi Trophy was raised in front of millions of viewers, Romanowski had touched the pinnacle of the sport. He had achieved what very few ever do. He was a Super Bowl champion. But what many people don't understand is that glory doesn't always bring peace. For Romanowski, winning was only the beginning of a new pressure. Once you've reached the top, the whole world starts expecting you to stay there. Every next season is no longer an opportunity. It becomes an obligation. Coaches demand more. Teammates expect more. Fans want to see their team keep dominating. And Romanowski, like so many players on that roster, began to feel a quiet but never-ending pressure. The pressure to win again. Every game now wasn't just a game. It felt like a test. One small mistake could be blown up by the media. One loss could bring criticism to the entire team. Romanowski began living in a state of near-constant tension. In the locker room, at practice, even when he left the stadium, his mind was always on the next game. Football was no longer the place to release emotions like when he was younger. It became a heavy responsibility, a vortex that once you stepped into, it was very hard to escape. Gradually, Romanowski realized that football was changing him. The competitive fire he had carried since childhood now burned fiercer than ever, but along with it came stress, exhaustion, and a feeling that he always had to prove something. If a game didn't go as hoped, Romanowski would blame himself. If the team lost, he carried that sense of failure with him for days. Those around him started to notice that Romanowski never truly relaxed. Even after winning a championship, he wouldn't allow himself to enjoy it for too long. Because in his mind, yesterday's win didn't guarantee tomorrow's. There is a paradox that many great athletes have to face. When you achieve your dream, you think you'll feel happy and at peace. But sometimes what happens is the complete opposite. For Romanowski, those 2 Super Bowl rings didn't bring relief. They only made him feel that he had to protect that reputation at all costs. Football began to become an obsession, a race with no finish line. And in that process, Romanowski also started to become more ferocious on the field. Every tackle harder, every collision more brutal. For him, if football was war, then winning was the only way to prove that all the pain was worth it. But those who watched closely began to notice something. Romanowski wasn't just fighting opponents. He was fighting himself with the fear of failure, with the pressure of reputation and with a fire inside that seemed never willing to go out. And as the following years of his career unfolded, that fire would take Romanowski to new heights in football. But it would also bring storms he had never imagined. After the glorious years with the San Francisco 49ers, Bill Romanowski's career moved into a new chapter when he signed with the Philadelphia Eagles. It was a completely different environment from the 49ers. If San Francisco was a smooth, disciplined winning machine, then Philadelphia felt like a real battlefield. The Eagles at that time were famous for their ferocious defense, where players were encouraged to play tough, intense, and unforgiving. For Romanowski, that environment felt almost tailor-made for him. After years of learning how to survive in the NFL, he was no longer a rookie proving himself. He became a starter, someone responsible for leading the defense on the field. But with the bigger role came greater intensity. Romanowski's games began to become more ferocious than ever. Philadelphia was a place where football was played with almost raw emotion. The fans in the stands were famously passionate, sometimes ruthless, and they loved players who were willing to fight to the end. Romanowski quickly became the kind of player this city celebrated. Every hard tackle, every brutal hit made the crowd explode. But behind those cheers was another truth. Romanowski began pushing himself to limits few players dared to reach. On the field, he wasn't just playing to stop opponents. He played as if he was in a real war. The games during this period became more violent, not just for Romanowski, but across the entire NFL of the 1990s. Collisions between players over 200 pounds moving at full speed created devastating impacts. Games sometimes turned chaotic, where emotions erupted in an instant. And Romanowski, with his intense competitive instinct, was often at the center of those moments. He charged into plays with a ferocity that left many stunned. There were times when Romanowski didn't just want to stop an opponent. He wanted to make them remember forever that they had to face him. Gradually, Romanowski's reputation began to shift. Before, he was known as a great linebacker, a Super Bowl champion, a player with admirable fighting spirit. But as the games grew more intense, his image in many people's eyes started to become more complicated. Opponents didn't just respect Romanowski, they began to hate him. The overly hard hits, the taunting words after each play, and the way he played with almost uncontrollable intensity made many opposing players feel that Romanowski had crossed the line of normal football. In the Eagles' locker room, that was sometimes seen as an advantage. Romanowski was the kind of player who made opponents think twice every time they stepped onto the field. If a running back saw him lined up in the defense, they knew every step they took came with the risk of a brutal collision. If a quarterback held the ball too long, Romanowski could appear in a flash with a tackle that shook the entire stadium. But outside the field, the media began to look at Romanowski with a different eye. The articles no longer just talked about his abilities. They started talking about his aggression, about the controversies, and about a player many believed was playing football in a way that was too dangerous. Romanowski seemed not to care about those criticisms. In his mind, football had never been a gentle game, it was always a war. And in a war, you couldn't step in with half strength. If opponents wanted to beat you, they would do whatever it took to do it. Romanowski believed the only way to survive was to be stronger than them, more ferocious than them, and never show fear. But over time, that philosophy began to create a gap between him and the rest of the league. Romanowski was no longer just a tough player. He became someone many opponents truly hated with a passion. The angry glares after collisions, the tense exchanges between players after the whistle, and the media arguments gradually became a familiar part of Romanowski's career. To some, he was an icon of toughness in football. To others, he was an example of how a player could go too far when obsessed with winning. But whether people loved or hated him, no one could deny one thing. Bill Romanowski had become one of the most controversial figures on the field, and as his career continued to move forward, that intensity showed no sign of letting up. On the contrary, it grew stronger, taking Romanowski to new heights in football. while also bringing bigger storms that the entire NFL would have to witness. When he left the Philadelphia Eagles, Bill Romanowski's career entered another new chapter. And this time, that chapter would take him to the peak of glory, as well as the center of the biggest storm in his life. His next destination was the Denver Broncos. When he joined the team, the Broncos were in a phase of chasing the ultimate title they had missed so many times before. The team was led by legendary quarterback John Elway, a man who had taken Denver to the Super Bowl multiple times, but still hadn't touched the Lombardi Trophy. In the Broncos' locker room, the hunger for victory was almost palpable in the air. The men there knew they were very close to history, and Romanowski, with his warrior nature, immediately blended into that atmosphere. If the years before had been grueling, the time in Denver was even more intense. Romanowski was now a veteran, a player who had been through many NFL battles and understood exactly what it took to win. He became a key part of the Broncos' defense. Every practice, every game was played with near-extreme intensity. The Broncos didn't just want to win, they wanted to dominate. And Romanowski was the perfect player for that philosophy. He played with everything he had. Every tackle, every collision felt like a declaration that he would never back down. Then the 1997 season arrived. The Broncos entered the playoffs with an experienced and determined roster. When they stepped into the Super Bowl, Romanowski knew he was standing before another historic moment in his career. That game was fierce, tense, and full of brutal collisions. But when the final whistle blew, the Broncos did what the entire city of Denver had waited years for. They became Super Bowl champions. Romanowski raised the Lombardi Trophy for the third time in his career. And just 1 year later, the Broncos did it again. 2 consecutive Super Bowls. For any player, that was the peak of a career. But for Romanowski, life at that moment didn't feel like a fairy tale. It felt like a storm. Football at this level demanded everything. It demanded more physically, more mentally, more in sacrifice. Practices grew heavier. Games grew more violent. Each season felt like a 4-month-long war where the body was beaten down constantly and the mind was always stretched by the pressure to win. Romanowski began to feel that more clearly than ever. To keep his spot on the roster, he had to be stronger. To maintain his reputation as a champion, he had to play more ferociously. And to protect his team, he was willing to become more ruthless. In many people's eyes, Romanowski was now living in his most brilliant era. He was a multiple Super Bowl champion, a renowned linebacker, and someone his teammates trusted in big games. But deep inside, Romanowski knew the price of all that was growing higher. His body began to feel the accumulated hits from years of play more clearly. The post-game pains lasted longer. There were mornings when he woke up and needed several minutes just to stand up straight. But in the NFL world, no one talked much about pain. You just stepped onto the field and kept playing. Romanowski also began pushing himself to limits he had never thought of before. If opponents played hard, he would play harder. If the game got tense, he would charge in with even greater intensity. For Romanowski, football was no longer just a profession. It became a constant test of will. Every week he asked himself the same question: how much further could he go? But that fire, the one that had taken Romanowski to the heights of his career, also began to cast shadows around him. The media paid more and more attention to his ferocious playing style. Opponents looked at him with angrier eyes. And controversies started appearing more and more frequently. Romanowski was no longer just a champion. He became a controversial figure in the NFL, someone many respected, but plenty also feared and despised. And as the storm of reputation, pressure, and ferocity continued to sweep Romanowski along, he kept doing the only thing he knew: keep fighting. Because for Bill Romanowski, stopping had never been an option. But when glory reached its peak, the storm surrounding Bill Romanowski also began to grow fiercer than ever. For many years, Romanowski had built his reputation as a fearless warrior on the field. But now, that reputation started to carry a dark side. The brutal games, the savage collisions, and his hot-tempered personality gradually became the focus of the media. What teammates once saw as fighting spirit was now viewed by many outsiders as aggression that crossed the line. And then one moment caused the entire country to turn its back on him. In a tense game, Romanowski faced off against J.J. Stokes. Taunting words, brutal hits, and rising emotions caused the situation to spiral out of control. In a fit of rage, Romanowski spat in Stokes' face, an act that left the entire stadium stunned into silence for a few seconds. In that single moment, his image changed completely. What had once been called toughness was now labeled with a different word: dirty. Television networks replayed that moment over and over. Newspapers across America covered the incident. Sports commentators debated the line between intensity and unacceptable behavior in football. Overnight, Romanowski became the center of a media storm. Headlines called him the villain of the NFL. Long articles analyzed his playing style, questioning whether Romanowski was breaking the spirit of the sport. For many fans, his image was shattered. The man who had once raised 4 Super Bowl trophies was now mentioned as one of the league's most controversial players. But for Romanowski, none of that changed how he viewed football. In his mind, the field was still a battlefield. And on a battlefield, you couldn't step in with weakness. Romanowski had grown up believing that if you showed softness, the world would crush you. That belief had followed him through childhood, through high school, through Boston College, and throughout his NFL career. So when the whole world began criticizing him, Romanowski didn't change the way he played. He continued charging into tackles with the same intensity. He continued competing with the same ferocity. But now everyone was watching. Every one of Romanowski's hits was captured on camera. Every action on the field was dissected. If he played too hard, it became a headline. If he argued with an opponent, it became a story on TV. Romanowski gradually realized that he was no longer just a football player. He had become a controversial icon, someone many saw as the embodiment of the dark side of the NFL. In the locker room, his teammates still respected him. They knew Romanowski was willing to sacrifice his body for the team. They knew he was the one who would step up in the toughest games, but outside the field, his image grew increasingly isolated. Opponents hated him. The media criticized him, and fans split into 2 camps: those who believed Romanowski was a symbol of football's harsh reality, and those who thought he had gone too far. But what makes the story heartbreaking is that Romanowski seemed to know no other way to survive. His entire life had been built on one single philosophy: be tougher than everyone else. Fight harder. Never back down. In football, weakness wasn't just failure. It could be the end of a career. And Romanowski, who had spent his youth fighting, didn't know how to live any other way. So despite the storm of criticism, he kept stepping onto the field every week with the same cold warrior's gaze. But as his reputation grew more and more controversial, other shadows began to emerge behind the scenes of the NFL secrets that would later shake the entire story of Bill Romanowski. But the storms around Bill Romanowski didn't stop at on-field controversies. As his career pushed deeper into the late 1990s and early 2000s, another reality of the NFL era began to slowly come to light. It was a secret that many in the league at the time knew, but few spoke about openly. Football was getting faster, stronger, and harsher. Players were bigger, more muscular, faster, and hitting harder than ever. And in that environment, many began searching for anything that could give them even a slight edge. Romanowski later admitted something that many of his contemporaries still tried to deny. He had used performance-enhancing substances, including steroids and HGH. To many outsiders, that was a shock, but to those who truly understood the NFL of that era, the truth was far more complex. Those years, The league felt like an arms race in physicality. Players were demanded to be bigger, stronger, and recover faster from devastating injuries. Every week was a battle, and after each battle, their bodies were pounded relentlessly. In such an environment, many started looking for ways to push the limits of the human body even further. Romanowski wasn't the only one doing it, but he was one of the few who later dared to speak openly about it. In Romanowski's mind at the time, everything was simple. The NFL was a place where only the strongest survived. If you were slower, weaker, or recovered slower than your opponent, you would be replaced. A younger, healthier rookie was always ready to take your spot. So when Romanowski turned to methods that boosted strength and recovery, he believed he was just doing what was necessary to keep playing. He didn't see it as cheating. He saw it as a way to survive in a brutal system. But as years passed and stories about doping in sports began to be investigated more thoroughly, that past came back to haunt him. Romanowski's admissions appeared in interviews and in the book he wrote about his life. The media reacted immediately. Those who had once criticized his playing style now had a new reason to condemn him. They said Romanowski's success didn't come just from his fighting will. They claimed it also came from the banned substances he had used. His reputation was severely damaged. The debates erupted across every sports show. Some viewed Romanowski as a symbol of a dark era in the NFL, when many players did whatever it took to boost their strength. Others saw the story differently. They argued that Romanowski was simply a product of that era, a player caught up in a system where the pressure to win was so immense that many were willing to risk everything. Romanowski didn't dodge the story. Instead of denying it, he spoke about it bluntly. He admitted what he had done, but he also talked about the context of that time. Football wasn't a normal sport. It was a place where the human body was pushed to extreme limits. Collisions could destroy a career in a single second. Injuries could take everything away from a player. In that world, Romanowski believed he was just doing what was necessary to keep fighting. But his candor wasn't enough to change how the public saw him. In many people's eyes, Romanowski was no longer just a controversial player. He had become a symbol of an era where the line between natural strength and artificial enhancement had blurred. Still, one thing never changed in the way Romanowski viewed football. He still believed the field was a battlefield, and on a battlefield, no one asks how you won. People only remember who was still standing after the fight. But as the secrets of that era gradually came to light, Romanowski also began moving closer to a moment even he couldn't control, one incident that would become one of the biggest scandals in his entire career. The controversies over steroids and his violent playing style had already shaken Bill Romanowski's reputation. But even then, he still had one thing keeping him upright: his career on the field. Romanowski was still an NFL player, still a warrior stepping onto the field every week. As long as he was playing, there were still people willing to overlook the controversies to focus on his ability. But then one moment happened. One moment that lasted only a few seconds and nearly brought down everything he had built over so many years. The incident occurred during a practice session. At the time, Romanowski was playing for the Oakland Raiders, the final team in his career. That practice day was like any other in the NFL. Intense, competitive, and full of contact. Young players were trying to prove they deserved a spot on the roster. Veterans like Romanowski were trying to maintain the brutal standards they believed football demanded. In one drill, Romanowski went up against a young player on the team, Marcus Williams. Williams was a rookie, a young man trying to carve out a place in America's toughest league. What happened next became one of the most infamous moments in NFL history. As the tension between the two escalated, Romanowski lost control. He threw a punch straight into Williams's face. That punch wasn't just an angry reaction. It was a full-force blow from a linebacker weighing over 200 pounds, a man who had spent his entire life charging into collisions. Marcus Williams went down. When other players rushed over, they realized how serious it was. Williams's eye socket had been shattered. The injury was so severe it nearly ended the rookie's career before it truly began. The news spread out of the practice facility like wildfire. The media exploded immediately. What had once been just controversy now became a nationwide scandal. Sports networks replayed the story non-stop. Commentators questioned whether Romanowski was one of the most dangerous players in NFL history. Headlines appeared with heavy words: out of control, violent, dangerous. But the story didn't stop there. Marcus Williams decided to sue Romanowski in court. The lawsuit quickly became one of the most high-profile cases involving on-field violence between players in NFL history. Williams claimed that Romanowski's punch had destroyed his career. A young man with NFL dreams suddenly lost everything in just a few seconds. The court later ruled that Romanowski had to pay Williams hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages. For Romanowski, that was the moment when everything truly collapsed. People who once defended him went silent. Those who criticized him felt they had been proven right. In the public's eyes, Romanowski was no longer just a player who played too hard. He had become a symbol of loss of control in professional sports. For the NFL, the incident was also a wake-up call. Football had always been a violent sport. But what happened between Romanowski and Williams wasn't a tackle during a game. It happened in practice, between two teammates. That made many people question the league's cutthroat, competitive culture. And what about Romanowski? For the first time in his career, he had to face a painful truth. The anger he had carried his whole life, the thing that once made him a warrior on the field, had now turned back to destroy his own image. For so many years, Romanowski believed that ferocity was the key to surviving in football. But the punch to Marcus Williams showed that there was a line even a warrior could not cross. After the incident, Romanowski's career was never the same again. He continued playing for a while longer, but the name Romanowski was now forever tied to that scandal. Whenever people mentioned him, they didn't just talk about the Super Bowl rings or the great games. They talked about that punch, a moment that lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to change the entire way the world looked at Bill Romanowski. And as his career gradually came to an end, Romanowski had to face a question he had never truly asked himself before. After all the battles, after all the glory and scandals, what did he really have left? After the incident with Marcus Williams, Bill Romanowski's career was never the same again. The final years in the NFL passed much more heavily than the glorious days before. His body had endured thousands of collisions. His reputation had been worn down by scandals. And then finally, the moment every professional athlete must face arrived. Romanowski retired. When that decision was made, a long chapter of his life came to a close. But what many people didn't understand was that when the stadium lights went out, a different battle truly began. For nearly 2 decades, Romanowski's life had been defined by football. Every week there was a game. Every day there was practice. Every season there was a goal. His life moved to the familiar rhythm of the NFL. The opening whistle, the crash of massive bodies, the roar of the crowd in the stands. But when his career ended, all of that vanished almost instantly. No more cheers, no more stadiums, no more adrenaline rush every time he stepped onto the field on Sunday. Instead, there was only silence. For many former NFL players, that silence is the most terrifying thing. In the early days after retirement, Romanowski would wake up in the morning and realize there was no practice waiting for him. No game at the end of the week. No clear goal to prepare for. His body, so used to the grueling rhythm of professional sports, began reacting differently. The pains he had once tried to ignore became more noticeable. Knees ached. Back stiffened after sleep. Old injuries started reminding him of the price his body had paid. But the physical pain was only part of the story. The harder part was the memories. When football no longer filled his mind completely, Romanowski began to recall the years that had passed, the brutal gains, the ferocious hits, the glorious moments when he raised the Super Bowl trophy. But mixed in were heavier memories, the controversies, the mistakes, the moments when the whole world turned its back on him. In the silence of life after football, all of that became clearer than ever. Romanowski was not the only one to experience this feeling. Many former NFL players fell into crisis after retirement. For years, they lived in a world where everything had clear structure: practice, play, win. When that world disappeared, many felt lost. Some struggled with injuries, some faced depression, some simply didn't know what to do with the rest of their lives. Romanowski was no exception. There were days he felt empty. All his life he had been known as a warrior, a ferocious linebacker, a Super Bowl champion. But when football disappeared, he had to face a question he had never thought about before. If he was no longer an NFL player, who was Bill Romanowski? That question wasn't easy to answer. For many years, he had defined himself by the battles on the field. But now that battle was over. No more opponents in front of him. No more games to prepare for. There was only a man who had to learn how to live in the normal world. A quieter world, a slower world, but also a more confusing one for someone who had grown used to the intensity of the NFL. And in that silence, Romanowski began to realize something he had never allowed himself to think about before. Football didn't just bring glory. It also left wounds that many people couldn't see. Those wounds weren't just in his body, they were in his memory, in his emotions, and in the way he looked back on his past. But it was from that post-war silence that Romanowski also began a new journey, a journey to understand more clearly what football had done to him, and how a warrior could learn to live after the biggest battle of his life had ended. The silence after retirement gradually became familiar to Bill Romanowski. But as life slowed down, he began to notice something that worried him. At first, it was just small moments. Romanowski would sometimes forget an appointment. There were times he walked into a room and suddenly couldn't remember why he was there. Things like that could happen to anyone, but when they started happening more often, Romanowski felt something was wrong. Throughout his career, he had grown used to his body hurting after every game, knees in pain, shoulders sore, back stiff. That was the price every NFL player had to pay. But what he began experiencing now was completely different. These weren't visible injuries. Over time, Romanowski noticed his memory wasn't as sharp as before. There were stories he had told hundreds of times, but now he would stop in the middle because he couldn't remember what came next. There were days when his mood changed in ways he couldn't explain. Sometimes he became more irritable. Other times he felt exhausted, as if his mind was being pulled down by an invisible weight. What worried Romanowski the most was that he knew very well where the cause might lie. Throughout nearly 2 decades of playing, Romanowski was involved in thousands of brutal collisions. Football in the NFL isn't just a sport. It's massive trains slamming into each other at full speed. Tackles can send both players crashing down like sledgehammers pounding their bodies. And in all those collisions, players' heads often take the hardest impact. While he was still playing, Romanowski rarely thought about it. If he got dinged after a hit, he'd shake his head for a few seconds and get right back on the field. That was the culture of football back then. No one wanted to look weak. But now, looking back, Romanowski starts thinking about a disease that more and more former NFL players fear: CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, caused by repeated head impacts. Studies in the years after he retired began showing that many former football players had to live with invisible brain damage. Those injuries could lead to memory loss, emotional changes, even depression. Romanowski doesn't know for sure if he has CTE. The disease is usually only confirmed after someone passes away, but the signs he's feeling make him unable to stop thinking about it. The thousands of hits over 16 years in the NFL may have left consequences far greater than he ever imagined. What breaks Romanowski's heart is that when he was young, no one really talked about these risks. Football was seen as the ultimate symbol of strength and courage. Players were praised for their ability to endure pain and keep playing. If you got concussed, you went back in. If you were hurt, you taped it up and kept going. Romanowski lived by that philosophy his entire career. But now, he begins to realize that those battles may have left wounds far deeper than anyone could see. Wounds that no one can see. Unlike a torn knee ligament or a broken arm, brain damage doesn't show up on the surface of the body. It quietly exists inside, changing the way a person thinks, feels, and sees the world. Romanowski started reading more about brain injury research. He listened to the stories of other former players who were also trying to understand what was happening to their bodies and minds. There were nights Romanowski lay awake, thinking about every collision in his career. Thousands of times his head slammed into an opponent's helmet. Thousands of times he got back up after being knocked down. When he was young, he saw that as proof he was tough enough to survive. But now, those memories carry a different meaning. Football gave Romanowski everything: fame, glory, 4 Super Bowl rings. But it may also have left wounds he will have to live with for the rest of his life. And for the first time since he stepped onto a football field as a boy in Connecticut, Romanowski began to understand that there are battles even a warrior cannot win with sheer strength alone. But instead of letting fear control him, Romanowski decided to do what he had always done throughout his life: face it head-on. Because if football had taught him one thing, it was that no matter how tough the battle, you still have to get up and find a way to keep moving forward. After beginning to confront the worrying signs about his memory and emotions, Bill Romanowski realized his life had entered a completely different phase. Throughout his NFL career, he always believed the only way to overcome any difficulty was to fight harder. But this time, the opponent wasn't a running back charging at him. This opponent was far more invisible. The damage football may have left in his body and mind. And for the first time in his life, Romanowski realized that victory no longer lay in defeating others. It lay in learning how to heal himself. Romanowski decided to change. For many years of playing, he had grown accustomed to pushing his body to extreme limits. But now, he began focusing on something entirely different: recovery. He started researching deeply into brain health, nutrition, and methods to help the body heal after years of enduring injuries. Romanowski read studies on brain trauma, met with experts, and experimented with new approaches to improve his mental health. One of the biggest changes was how he viewed food. Throughout his NFL career, nutrition was mostly about eating enough to maintain muscle and strength. But now, Romanowski began seeing food as a tool to heal the body. Together with his wife, Julie Romanowski, he started building a new project. They founded the company Nutrition 53, a business focused on nutritional products for brain health and body recovery. For Romanowski, this wasn't just a business venture. It felt like a personal mission. He wanted to understand more deeply what had happened to his body after so many years of football, and he wanted to help other athletes avoid going through the same things. Romanowski also began changing his lifestyle. He tried meditation, something the younger version of himself probably never would have imagined. In the high-speed, high-emotion world of the NFL, sitting still and focusing on breathing felt almost alien. But Romanowski realized his mind needed the calm that football had never allowed. Gradually, meditation became part of his daily routine. It helped him control his emotions, reduce stress, and find a balance he had never had before. What's notable is that Romanowski also started speaking more openly about the consequences of football. For many years, the culture of the NFL often encouraged players to stay silent about pain. But Romanowski understood that if no one talked about these issues, the next generation of players might have to pay the same price he did. He appeared in interviews, sports programs, and conferences on athlete health. In those conversations, Romanowski spoke candidly about the hits, the injuries, and the risks that football can bring. That wasn't easy for someone who had once been known as a ferocious warrior on the field. But Romanowski understood that strength doesn't just lie in enduring pain. Sometimes strength lies in admitting that you need to change. Gradually, Romanowski's image also began to shift. To many people, he remained the controversial NFL player, but others started to see a different side of this man. A man who had once lived in the storm of football, now trying to build a new path, one focused on health, awareness, and recovery. Romanowski is still a warrior, but his battle has changed. Before, he fought opponents on the field. Now, he fights to better understand the wounds football left behind and to find ways to heal them. And in that journey, Romanowski began to discover something he had never allowed himself to think about for so many years. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't a Super Bowl trophy. Sometimes the greatest victory is learning how to live again after the war. Bill Romanowski's journey isn't like the perfect sports stories people usually tell on television. It's not the tale of a hero who's always right, always loved, and always walking in the light. Romanowski's life is far more complicated. He was one of the most controversial players in NFL history. There were moments when the entire country turned its back on him. There were actions that even Romanowski himself later had to look back on with a heavy heart. He caused controversy. He hurt others. He became a villain in the public's eyes. In the world of sports, where everything is often divided into black and white, Romanowski is a man who's hard to define. But if you look deeper, his story isn't just about controversy. It's also about extraordinary endurance. Over 16 years in the NFL, Romanowski stepped onto the field hundreds of times like a true warrior. He played for big teams like the San Francisco 49ers, Denver Broncos, and Oakland Raiders. In that career, he won 4 Super Bowl championships, an achievement very few players can match. But those titles only tell a small part of the story. What makes Romanowski special isn't just the championship rings, it's the way he stepped into every game as if it were the last battle of his life. Football gave Romanowski everything a boy growing up in Connecticut ever dreamed of. It gave him fame, money, glorious moments in front of millions of viewers. But football also took a lot away. It left accumulated wounds on his body from thousands of collisions. It dragged him into storms of controversy that sometimes he couldn't even control. And after the stadium lights went out, it left questions that took Romanowski years to answer. There's one thing many people don't realize when looking at professional athletes. When they step onto the field, they look like invincible men. But behind that armor, they're still human. They carry fear, anger, and wounds the world rarely sees. Romanowski is clear proof of that. The competitive fire that once made him one of the most feared linebackers in the NFL was also the fire that caused him to cross the line many times. But what makes Romanowski's story special is that he didn't let his mistakes become the end of the story. After retiring, he began facing his past, his injuries, and the consequences football left behind. He changed his lifestyle, took care of his health, and shared his story with others. That wasn't an easy path, but it showed that even a warrior who once lived in the storm of the NFL can learn to seek peace. So when looking at Romanowski's entire life, we see a paradox. Football destroyed many parts of him. The hits, the anger, the scandals, they all left deep marks. But football also created him. It forged his will, his resilience, and his ability to get back up after failure. Without football, the world might never have known Bill Romanowski, but it was also football that forced him to learn how to live again after the war. And that may be what makes Romanowski's story so memorable. Some legends are remembered for their victories. Other legends are remembered for the battles they survived. Bill Romanowski is one of those. Bill Romanowski's story leaves people both admiring and heartbroken. When looking back at his entire journey, we see a man who went through nearly every extreme of American sports, the highest glory and the most painful mistakes. Romanowski is someone who won 4 Super Bowl championships with teams like the San Francisco 49ers and Denver Broncos, something very few players in NFL history have achieved. But along with that glory came a heavy price: controversies that damaged his image. From spitting in J.J. Stokes' face to the punch that shattered teammate Marcus Williams' eye socket, the moment our story described as the point when his career nearly collapsed. After retiring, Romanowski no longer had stadium lights or crowd cheers, only lingering physical pain, worries about CTE, and heavy memories from thousands of hits over 16 years of playing. Those details make his story heartbreaking. A warrior who once terrified opponents, now facing invisible wounds inside his own body. But what deserves respect in Romanowski is that he didn't run from his past. Together with his wife, he built a nutrition company focused on brain health and spoke openly about football's consequences. That's a very American image. A man who made mistakes, was criticized, but still got back up to change and give back to the community. The lesson for Americans isn't to glorify football's violence, but to understand the real cost of glory. True strength doesn't just lie in winning on the field. It lies in taking responsibility, making amends, and finding ways to heal after life's battles. If the story of Bill Romanowski makes you reflect on the real cost of glory in the NFL, please hit subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring the turbulent journeys of American sports legends. Thank you for watching to the end, and see you in the next video where we'll keep telling the stories of people who fought, fell, and rose again before the whole world.